Hello. It's a week after Easter now, and as you all know, we're still locked down. We're going to be for a bit longer. But we're into this routine now of worshipping in different ways, of thinking in different ways, and we'll carry on doing these video messages for as long as it takes until we get to the point where it's possible to be back in church again. I promised you last week that as part of our thinking in these weeks over Easter and beyond, we'd track the progress of our blue tits. And I'm pleased to say that they've had a busy week, slightly behind schedule. They've been laying eggs. I don't think they really care about doing it exactly for Easter, but there are eggs in the nest now, as you can see. There will be more, I expect, because they often lay 8 or 9, usually about 1 a day. So it takes time to build up the full clutch before they start sitting on them. But things are at least well on the way in the world of blue tits, and indeed the world in general. And I'm sure when you've looked out in your gardens or been out on your walks or whatever you are able to do in these rather strange times, I'm sure you'll have seen some of the blossom and some of the lovely signs of new life and spring that we were talking about last week for Easter. This time after Easter is often called EasterTide. I think from the point of view of the stories about Jesus and his disciples, it's actually a fascinating part of the liturgy as it unfolds through the year. It's the time of year when we hear some of the stories about this critical period after Jesus' resurrection and before his ascension. Just over a few weeks, so many amazing things happened in the life of his disciples as he appeared to them and was very much present with them, even though not quite in the same way as he had been before he was killed. So it's an exciting few weeks. The reading today comes from John's Gospel, and it's the story of some of Jesus' first meetings with his disciples after the resurrection. Late that same day, the first day of the week, when the disciples were together behind locked doors for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them. "Peace be with you," he said. Then he showed them his hands and his side. On seeing the Lord, the disciples were overjoyed. Jesus said again, "Peace be with you. As the Father sent me, so I send you." Then he breathed on them, saying, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you pronounce them unforgiven, they remain." One of the 12, Thomas the twin, was not with the rest when Jesus came. So the others kept telling him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said, "Unless I see the mark of the nails on his hands, unless I put my finger into the place where the nails were, and my hand into his side, I will never believe it." A week later, his disciples were once more in the room, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them, saying, Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here. Look at my hands. Reach your hand here and put it into my side. Be unbelieving no longer, but believe." Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, you have found faith. Happy are they who find faith without seeing me." There were indeed many other signs that Jesus performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But those written here have been recorded in order that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that through this faith you may have life by his name. That story about Thomas is one of my favourites. It's such a human, realistic, raw story of experiences and emotions in these days after Jesus was raised from the dead. I saw a cartoon yesterday about working from home. A lot of people, of course, are working from home at the moment and are forced to because of the shutdown. You may be one of them. But part of working from home for many people is using internet video conferencing in order to interact with colleagues and whoever you need to talk to and discuss things with. Anyway, the cartoon was simply a computer screen in the middle of a video conference meeting. There were 12 spaces for participants on the screen. 11 were occupied by pictures of the 11 disciples, and the 12th space was Jesus. There wasn't actually a picture of him, it just had his name, Jesus, on it, as happens sometimes if people on those conferences don't connect their cameras. So one of the disciples was saying, "Jesus? How did he get into this meeting?" And then Thomas, our friend from the story we just heard, said, "I'll only believe it's him if he turns his camera on." Well, that's a kind of 21st century take on that gospel story, isn't it? Seeing is believing, we sometimes say. And for Thomas, that was absolutely true. Seeing really was believing. Not only seeing, but touching and feeling and really wanting that physical evidence of Jesus in life and present. These weeks in between Easter and Ascension were a period in the original story when Jesus did indeed appear on an ongoing basis to his disciples and friends. And when he was with them, he was there very physically and very much ordinarily alive. And yet, at the same time, there was a mystic element to his presence because, as we heard, he could come into locked rooms without opening the door. So it's quite hard to get a handle on what really was happening here. Of course, I'm a scientist and I believe in evidence and proof and all the things that go along with scientific training. But at the same time, one of the reasons that I love this story about Thomas meeting Jesus is that although he wanted to have that proof, although he desperately longed for the evidence, and in fact needed the evidence to really convert his thinking to the fact that Jesus was indeed alive, actually that's not really the point of the story. The point of the story, much more, is what Jesus said. How much better it is for people who can believe without seeing and touching. And we are some of those people who are aware of God's presence, are aware of the presence of Jesus as a living being, but without being able to reach out and touch him in quite the same way that Thomas was privileged to do. The other interesting thing in this story is that Jesus came to them and said, "Peace be with you," and he breathed the Holy Spirit on them. It's a slightly curious phrase, but it was very important as well, for more than one reason. One thing was that it was a kind of a preview of Pentecost, when God's Holy Spirit would be poured out on lots of people, on everybody. But also it was a kind of empowerment for the disciples. The Greek word for spirit is pneuma, the same word that we use for pneumatic drills, for pneumatic tyres, pneumatic power, the power of air. And so to breathe the pneuma, that's a really significant kind of image that Jesus uses. We know that even the biggest vehicles and heaviest trucks can have their weight taken by pneumatic tyres, by the pressure and the power of the air in tyres. And that's how Jesus wanted his disciples to understand the power of the Holy Spirit, that they were empowered from that point on to go out and be Jesus' people in the world, go out and continue the mission that he had begun in the journeying around that he and his friends had done together in the years before he was killed. So there are a lot of really important motifs in this story that we need to take away with us. The power of the Holy Spirit, the peace of Jesus, the reality that faith is about believing even when you can't touch and you can't see. These were the kind of first steps for the disciples for the rest of time. The disciples representing us, representing God's people through all the generations since then. People empowered by the Holy Spirit to go and continue God's mission, and to go with the peace of Jesus. Peace be with you, John wrote, quoting Jesus several times in that story. So it's really important. We're living through times that are not entirely peaceful and calm. In fact, for many people, these feel like quite unpeaceful, uncalm weeks and months as we live in these rather strange conditions of being locked down. we need to find that peace of Jesus, that power of God's Spirit to hold us and empower us as we just live through the present crisis. Adrian Lowe, who's one of our modern hymn writers, has written a song called When Our Futures Are Uncertain. It takes the story of Thomas and his doubts and his certainties and provides just a nice way of relating our own thoughts and our own doubts and our own uncertainties, plus our certainties in God, to the story of Thomas that we've been thinking about. So I'm going to put Adrian's words up on the screen. They're on the Singing the Faith website as well, and I'll put some music in the background. If you want to sing along, that's fine, or you might just like to read the words with the music playing to round off in prayer, in thought, the implications of today's story.